2 years ago, in this very room, I gave a lecture on dialogue, and we focused then on what it was, how you do it, why you do it. And after that, I did a blog on dialogue, and then I wrote a book on dialogue. So I guess you'd conclude that I am into dialogue. I think it's a very important and a very powerful process. Here's a kind of a theme that we will be focusing on throughout this afternoon together. We believe that dialogue is a human energizer. We can all use that. And it's a means to better end. Now, some of us here are old enough to remember having one of these boxes that had black and white pictures in them, and we thought they were great until we got boxes with color, and we made the transition, and we thought, wow, this is a whole new thing, much better. So we latch on to that comparison and say that things get better when dialogue becomes our default means of communication. Now, there are a lot of different ways of experiencing dialogue and practicing dialogue, and probably all of you have had some of these different kinds of experiences with dialogue. But today, we will focus on the benefits of experiencing dialogue interpersonally and in groups and verbally. So what do we mean by dialogue? Well, I love these expressions of some Native American Indians. They say things with a few words. And I like this statement. It's almost a great definition of dialogue. You talk and you talk until the talk starts. And so when the talk starts, maybe you're beginning to be in dialogue. Now, we're going to say a few things about what dialogue is not. If I focused on showing you how wrong you are in a conversation, then we would not be in dialogue. Sad. If I was trying to persuade you to see my point of view without being willing to listen to your point of view, we would not be in dialogue. If in a business, the boss told his subordinates that there was only one way to sell a product and wasn't willing to listen to any other suggestions, he and they would not be in dialogue. How about this one? If in Congress, only one party refused to consider any solution to the immigration problem, but theirs, they would not be in dialogue. On the other hand, now we get to the positive. When we listen for what is meant in a conversation or in a group and respond empathetically to what we are hearing, then we're in a dialogue environment. When we are asking questions to clarify and draw out the thinking of others, we are in a dialogue environment. When we resist becoming defensive, we're in a dialogue environment. I'm going to pause on this one. Carol is a long-term friend of mine, and we've had great dialogue together. She's a professor in a New York university, and she's an authority on a Southern novelist. And we were in a dialogue session one time, and she was telling me about having discovered a diary of a colleague of this Southern novelist. And then Carol said, and oh, by the way, this person whose dialogue she had discovered was in my seminary and was a graduate student of one of my favorite seminary professors. And oh, one more thing, said Carol. She was his mistress, and they were having an affair. Well, you can imagine the defensive hackles that shot up with me. I wanted to defend my professor. But then I realized, hey, we're in dialogue. I can't get defensive. And so we kept talking about it and exploring what that meant and the implications, and I survived. When we acknowledge that on which we disagree, but seek to find that on which we do agree, then we are in a dialogue environment. When we're not trying to persuade one another, but to mutually discover things together, we are in a dialogue environment. When we find ourselves changing our views, our positions, in light of what we're discovering, then we're in a dialogue environment. And this is when the transformation begins. Transformational dialogue begins when we change. So one of the benefits of dialogue is we change, and mostly for the better. Back to our theme. It's a human energizer and a means to better ends. Now, dialogue is not new. In fact, it's been around for centuries. And there are a lot of people who have contributed to our understanding of dialogue. Some of the names are up here on the screen. Is dialogue always appropriate? Not really. There are other means of communication that work well under different circumstances. Does it always work? No. I've tried dialogue on many occasions, and it's bombed, so it doesn't always work. Are there barriers to dialogue? Absolutely. But the benefits outweigh the barriers. That's what we want to communicate this afternoon. So what are the benefits of practicing transformational dialogue? Well, first of all, dialogue connects us as persons more than as personages. Now, that word personage comes from Paul Tournier, who was a Swiss psychotherapist, wrote a great book called The Meaning of Persons. And in it, he said, we frequently connect with one another as personages, which means, what do we look like? What are we wearing? What schools did we attend? Who did we marry? What kind of jobs have we had? What kind of hair we have or don't have? These are aspects of our personages, and that's the way we relate to one another a great deal. But if we really want to relate as persons, then Paul Tournier says, try dialogue, and we agree. Secondly, there are 10 of these. Secondly, transformation dialogue is a demonstration of love. One of my long-term friends, Jacqueline, who lives in Michigan, and Jacqueline and I have worked together and been friends for, 40-some years, I guess. And when I asked Jacqueline what our dialogue with one another had meant to her, her instant response was, Irving, that's easy, love. Well, I hadn't really put those two things together before then. But all of a sudden, I realized from what Jacqueline had just said that the characteristics of serious love and the characteristics of serious dialogue are marvelously congruent. Thirdly, dialogue is a means by which God's Spirit opens us to truth. Some of you may remember Dr. Donald Daw. He was a professor at the seminary here, professor of theology, and he also was a resident here at Westminster Canterbury. And we got to know each other, and we got to be friends, and we had some very serious dialogue with each other. And I asked him one time to tell me what he thought the theology was of dialogue. And here is what he said. It's a means by which God's Spirit opens us to truth. I liked that. Dialogue also has a way of penetrating walls, and it opens closed systems. Now I'll tell you a little story. I was invited to consult with a research facility in Geneva, Switzerland. And the facility had scientists, the research scientists, whose job it was to generate some products that could be marketed. And there were also patent attorneys in that facility, whose job it was to take the output of the scientists and patent them and make them products for marketing, okay? However, the problem seemed to be that the scientists did their work and came up with findings, but they were not always patentable. And the patent attorneys said, hey, we haven't got anything to patent. So my job, as I was invited to contribute, was to try to build some connections between these two. So we had an off-site retreat, multi-day retreat. And I decided to do something a little unusual. We did a role play, and we had little circles of attorneys and scientists in the same circle, and I put one patent attorney in the middle of each circle, and I said, you are a patent. And everybody in the circle could ask questions of this attorney who was role-playing that he was a patent. Some fascinating questions got asked, questions that had never been asked before. And of course, as you can suspect, after this exercise, conversation was much more informal, dialogue took place, and when they got back to their facility, scientists figured out ways to create products that could be patentable. So dialogue opens closed systems. Dialogue is a means to tap into tacit knowledge. A Hungarian scientist, Michael Polanyi, came up with this statement, and he also wrote a book about it. His point was that it's sort of like an iceberg. Our knowledge that we make most use of is on the top surface of the iceberg. But there's a lot more knowledge under that surface if we figure out a way to dig into it. And he said, dialogue is the way. Now, Harry is another friend of mine. And Harry and I engage in some heavy dialogue. We enjoy doing this together. And we've had dialogue on subjects like the 3-volume systematic theology of Paul Tillich, quantum physics, quantum theology, string theory. And whenever we get together for these dialogue sessions, we dig deep. We ask open questions of each other. We are listening to each other. We respect each other. And we always leave those dialogue sessions knowing more than even we thought we knew before we started. Number 6, dialogue stretches our levels of consciousness. Now, I'm going to pause on this, and this is a little bit heavy. We are all conscious. We have consciousness. Each of us brought his or her unique consciousness to this gathering this afternoon. Now, what does that include? It includes what we're watching. It includes what we are hearing. It includes what we remember, what we are thinking about that, what we are feeling about that. And if you put all of that together, we get our consciousness. And psychologists sometimes refer to it as the lens through which we view reality. Another group of psychologists say that our brains function like a symphony orchestra. All the players are out there in those neurons, billions of neurons in our brains, connected with synapses and electrochemical charges. But then something happens, and all those players come together to create music, and we have our unique consciousness. Now, our levels of consciousness evolve. We're made to stretch those levels of consciousness. And some developmental psychologists give levels of this. A guy named Kagan at Harvard spent 40 years studying and researching consciousness. And he said that we start when we're children, we have a level of consciousness. We get to be young adults, or we get to be youth, and then young adults, and then adults. And all along the way, our consciousness evolves to meet the various needs that we have at those levels of our lives. However, he said that not all that many people reach the higher levels of consciousness. It seems that in our adult lives, we frequently plateau, and only a small percentage of us reach the level of consciousness in which dialogue becomes a natural way to communicate. Now, fortunately, all of us here this afternoon have reached that level, right? We wouldn't be here if we hadn't reached that level, so that's a good thing. But this chart shows that at the various stages of consciousness, the percentage of people who are ready, I guess we would have to say, ready to engage in being inclusive, being participants, being willing to listen to one another, that percentage shrinks. However, said Kagan and his researchers, there are things we can do. We can curb our tendency to make instant judgments. We can be more patient to get beyond what is disagreeable. We can be more receptive to change. And if this sounds familiar, that's what I have in mind. This was Kagan saying this. And Stubbs and Naveed are saying this also fits dialogue. So what's the point? The point is dialogue can help us to stretch our levels of consciousness if we do these kinds of things. Now, what does that mean? I'm an optimist, and I optimistically feel that maybe 12% of the population of this country experience consciousness at the level that dialogue will be a very natural way of communicating. Now that's kind of discouraging if you think of all the rest of us, but think if the 12% included the leaders of business, the leaders of education, the leaders of politics, life would be different. And that's a mission worth giving a lot of attention to. So, 7, dialogue stimulates a larger intelligence with which to deal with heavy societal issues. David Bohm, who was a quantum physicist and a very important pioneer in dialogue, he said this, and he made some significant efforts to do it. And his point was that if we got people surrounding important issues like immigration, or like the homeless, or like climate change, and got them into a dialogue experience, we would have a much better chance of solving some of those problems than we do with current means of communicating about it. Wouldn't it be great if serious dialogue was practiced here? And I think both Democrats and Republicans might agree to that. All right, here's our theme. It's a human energizer, and it's a means to better end. Okay, the last 3 are these. Number 8, dialogue builds bridges. Here another story. I had worked with a group in England, and Roger had been a member of that group. And Roger and I had experienced dialogue with each other. So I was contacted. He was in England, I was in this country, and he said, I need your help. I listened. He said, I'm now responsible for merging 3 companies, one in France, one in Wales, one in America, They've been competitors in the same business. Now they are all owned by one company, and my job is to bring them together into one functioning competitive business. Will you help? Well, I've always sort of taken on whatever came, and I said, sure, Roger. Well, what that required was I had to do shuttle diplomacy, Paris, Wales, California. I had to sit down and talk with all of these people about how could we build bridges between what had been competitors and forge together one competitive business in the world that included their patents, their customers, their locations, their employees. What had happened? We did it. And we celebrated in Napa Valley. And it all happened because dialogue builds bridges. Dialogue also bonds for harmony. After serving in 2 pastorates, I was asked by my presbytery to start a new church. And we met in a school. And we created a brochure. And the brochure circulated to the neighborhood said, "We are not here to be a hotel for saints, but a hospital for sinners." And we had a lot of people sign up. We had some great experiences in that church. It was during the Vietnam War, and we were near a naval air station, and we had a lot of Navy pilots in the congregation and their families. And so when the Navy pilots came back from their carriers near Vietnam, they had some heavy stuff that they brought back with them. And we had lots of counseling with the pilots and lots of counseling with the pilots' families. And we began to build a real bonding experience. But we also created in the congregation small groups called koinonia groups. And everybody who was in the congregation was a member of a koinonia group. And we had couples that were the facilitators of the koinonia groups. And my wife and I met with those facilitator couples once a month to listen to their experiences and to help in any way we could. Well, let me tell you what happened. They brought some pretty heavy stuff into those monthly meetings. And they looked to me, "Hey, you got the credentials, you've got experience, tell us how to deal with this." And frankly, I didn't know how to deal with a lot of the stuff that they were bringing to the table in those sessions. So I had to acknowledge my lack of expertise. We had to learn to be more honest with each other because we couldn't pretend to know things we didn't know about. And it made us vulnerable. It made me vulnerable. And because of being honest and open and vulnerable with each other, we forged a bond that was very significant. The 10th benefit is that dialogue builds things. Jack became the CEO of a company that had been owned by a family, and his job was to build from that family-owned company a larger, more competitive business that would compete in their particular industry. He invited me to be his consultant. We had known each other for some years before and worked together in some other settings. We agreed that we would build the new company around dialogue. And so we did intensive training of all of his executives in dialogue. And we had sessions of those executives in which we, with dialogue, solved some serious problems and did some serious things together, including how do we assimilate a company that we've just acquired. Well, anyway, we used dialogue to build. And I asked Jack after he retired, what did he think the dialogue did in his company? And he said, well, first of all, we got new ideas from the dialogue. And secondly, we got facts on the table that probably we couldn't have gotten on the table if we hadn't used this kind of process to encourage people to speak out and to dig back into things that they knew. And thirdly, he said, when people realized that we were paying attention to them and listening to what they had to contribute, they were more motivated to act on the decisions that we were making. And did it work? Well, we started with sales of $630 million. We evolved to sales of more than $1.5 billion. We moved from 4,000 employees to 5,000 employees. So I guess we'd have to say dialogue builds things. What steps can we take to gain these benefits that we've been describing? Well, we can ask more open-ended questions. This is basic. We can be more careful with our assumptions. We frequently make the wrong assumptions. We can practice active listening, and if you check the internet, you get lots of help on how to do that. We can engage in tacit knowledge exploration like Harry and I have engaged in. We can participate in dialogue groups, and if you're not a part of a dialogue group, find one or start one. So, here are the 10 in review. And by the way, all of us here can tap into practically all of those 10 benefits if we choose to do so. It's a human energizer and a means to better ends. Now, your chance to respond. My friend Fareen Naveed and I have spent a good time this past year on an international survey on dialogue, on the practice of dialogue. And so she's very well versed in what we mean by dialogue. And I'm delighted to have her take the next step in our presentation this afternoon. Welcome, Fareen.
Thank you. All right, wonderful presentation. Thank you, Irving. What do you think about transformational dialogue? Does that really make sense? All right, so it needs active listening. All right. So, do you think that practicing dialogue needs some extra efforts? As we know that many people do not practice dialogue. And why? Because there are many barriers. But do you think that the benefits of practicing dialogues outweigh the barriers? And how? What are the additional benefits of practicing dialogue? Change in your mind, okay? And what could be the other benefits of practicing dialogue?
It becomes a mutual learning experience.
It's a mutual learning experience, okay? The more we talk, the more we listen, and the more we understand. All right.
You have to practice some self-control.
Okay, very good. Honesty. When people are honest, they listen better. Without, when we do dialogue, we don't have the fear of being judged, criticized, being corrected. There is a lot of empathy, support, listening, and all right. So, where do you think the dialogues are most needed? Is it most needed in family? Is it most needed in our community? Is it most needed in a political arena? Everywhere. Okay. And how do you think about the transformational dialogue? Does it how does it change actually? The perception, the thinking, the understanding, the bond, the love. How does it strengthen the relationships? That's very interesting. When we are talking, or when we are in talking, actually not in dialogue, we are more occupied, our brain is more occupied with what we are going to respond rather than listening to the person. And this is one of the big barriers in dialogue, that we are not listening. So what could be the other challenges?
There can be the challenge of rejection by the other person. There's a different ideology or value system, and you don't want to dialogue because you don't want to get hurt.
Exactly. Like the fear of being rejected, the fear of being not accepted. When Irving and I, we both were doing survey, and we talked about what are the resistance of doing the dialogue, and many people came up with the same thoughts that, we will be rejected, we have a fear, our opinion will not be accepted. And this is a big barrier. Yes, please.
Yes, our technology has brought us together a lot, but it's going to take more than technology. It's going to take people, and it's going to take respecting everybody and their opinion. So we're a whole lot of diverse worth in our personality and everything, but we've got to do this because we're seeing now what a calamity it will be if we don't dialogue with each other.
Exactly. And when you bring the subject of technology, now we are more busy, especially the young people are more busy with technology. We are more busy with our telephones, our iPads, our MacBooks, and we are not finding time to do dialogue. And when we are not finding time to do dialogue, then there is lack of understanding. There are issues in the relationship. There are everyday issues. So these are the challenges, we talked about. What, as we said, and as we all agreed, that the benefits there are challenges, but the benefits of doing dialogues overweight the barriers and the challenges. What could be the other benefits of doing dialogue? How it can transform our life, and how it can transform the whole world. Let's see and talk or think about the people sitting in the Senate or in White House, and they start doing the real dialogue. Let's think about it. The people in the world who are with big minds making big decisions, they are the one doing dialogue to solve the real problems of the world. Yes.
I just had a thought. One of the wonderful things that Jesus did was dialogue a great deal, both with his apostles, with the crowds, with the Pharisees, the bosses, and look what transformational things occurred.
Beautiful.
Quite amazing, huh? I just had a Bible study this morning, that's why.
Thank you so much for sharing. Okay, what else? What are the other benefits of doing dialogue? How it can transform us, our relationship, our community, and the whole world?
World peace.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for bringing this point. Think about if we have real dialogue, and we would have a real peace in the world, because we would be really listening. Yes, thank you. Anybody else want to share anything about it?
We get to know each other better.
Yes, we really get to know each other better. Thank you.
I'm finding it hard with some people to back and forth dialogue. I'm frustrated by it, and I don't know what I'm doing wrong.
Okay, that's very interesting. The question is that what to do when you really want to do dialogue, but it is not accepted, or there is some resistance from the other side. Then how to do that? How to continue practicing, or how to practice the dialogue in such tough environment? What do you think about it?
I mean, I even try to open up a conversation about things I know they're interested in. I try to learn about some people. Is it just me, or do any of you have this problem?
Yeah, I believe that many people have the same problem.
They have closed minds. Oh, I'm sorry. I believe a lot of people have closed minds. They're only interested in their own situation and their own moral deficiencies, and they don't want to hear about anybody else.
Unfortunately, many people, as we said, do not practice dialogue, or there are the level of consciousness we talk about that is also mentioned in Irving's book, and also he talked about that in the presentation, that there are different level of consciousness. And when some people are not open to dialogue, it means they are at a different level of consciousness than you. So, what to do? Should we stop doing dialogue with them? Do you think, again, getting back to the question, the benefits of doing dialogue overweight the barriers? And if the benefits of doing dialogue overweight the barriers or challenges, then I believe we should continue doing the dialogues. And what do you think, stage? All right, what, okay,
We all know that if we pass grade school and high school and college, we feel like we have just done it all. But I think that we fail to keep learning, and I mean really being open and everything. I think that would make a great deal of difference in how we relate to people, and it's not to become so opinionated. It's just to hear one another. And in response to her, sometimes you don't hear as well. Sometimes you couldn't hear as well as dialoguing with people, your residents in Westminster Canterbury. But it's just a very frustrating, very, very personal experience. But I think that the world is going by so fast. Everything is changing so that we've got to get on board. It seems like it's to me it's more of a challenge. I've noticed that. It's depressing and sometimes in a way that you can't do anything about it, but we're going to have to respond by coming together and listening to one another and hearing their viewpoints.
Exactly. I mean, finishing your college or university doesn't mean that the learning stops. And actual learning starts, I believe that I started learning when I was out of college and when I started doing more dialogues with the people.
I think a lot of people are afraid to open up their little network to other people. And they close their minds and they don't want to hear about it. And I guess you gotta let it have to do that if they want to.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Many people don't want to open to the dialogues, and there are different personalities. Some people are introverts, some people are not, So it can be the personality factor. Or maybe they are at the different level of consciousness.
I find frequently when you're dealing with politics or justice issues, some people feel like if they waver a little bit from their ideology, they're compromising themselves, or they tend to demonize people that don't agree with them, and they feel like if another ideology is represented, it would be, and they somehow acquiesced and entered into dialogue. Maybe they were compromising their belief systems, and they were traitors to their ideology.
That's very true. Thank you very much for bringing this point. Unfortunately, again, we are in an environment where we are taught, if you want to maintain your relationship with the people, do not talk about politics and do not talk about religion. That's exactly not true. If you want to have better relationship with the people, talk about everything, right? But yes, people have fear of, they have their strong belief when it comes to politics or the religion. They have strong beliefs and they think that talking about different perspective could change, or if, they have their own fears. So this is one of the barriers of carrying the dialogue. And the more we grow mature and the upper stage of consciousness, the more we practice dialogue, the more we learn to love, the more we learn to accept, the more we learn to create the bond, the more we have empathy and active listening, the more we are in a position to do better dialogue. This is what I believe. Yeah. Anything else you want to share? Do you feel yourself a little bit more motivated to practice dialogue than you came here?
Yeah, yes.
That's great to hear. Can you be a little louder, please? I have some hearing issue. When you're saying this, yes, you feel more motivated to practice dialogue. Do you feel more motivated to practice dialogue?
Yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you so very much. If there is anyone else wants to say something? Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to say, I've known your husband for some years now. And I knew that his wife was ethnically different, okay? And I always wondered why. And now I understand why. You're the one that had to do the compromising. Sorry, George.
Oh, he's wonderful. You know. So he has a lot of patience, and that's why he's tolerating me. So thank you very much, all of you, for your valuable time, for your comments. And I'm so glad to hear the most important thing, that you feel more motivated to practice dialogue. And I hope that you got a little bit, you all are, I was talking to George and I said that I'm so amazed to come here to see the people. They had, did a wonderful job. He was just talking to me that one of the guy is sitting here, I'm sorry, I don't know his name. He was a pilot and flew a plane. And, people did all this wonderful, amazing job, had an amazing life, amazing experience, and it could be so much wonderful to learn from all of you. And, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you very much for having me here and your time, and thank you.